Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you about asexual reproduction in plants, or in other words, vegetative reproduction. Now, right out of the gate, I just want to say that if plants are going to reproduce this way, asexually, it's going to be mitosis. And so all the cells that are generated from this type of growth are really the same as the parent cell. And so you're not getting any diversity, but you're getting new plants to be able to grow. And they're able to sort of propagate this way and expand. And the truth is, that's an advantage given some sort of environmental conditions, especially if the environment is consistent. It's a good way to reproduce very rapidly. And so there's some cool examples, some practical things that I want to talk to you about today about gardening that you may or may not be aware of. And so let's jump right into that conversation. And so what I want to say is that plants can clone themselves, and cloning implies that they're genetically the same. So one cell produces two cells asexually, and it's called vegetative reproduction. As you can see in this picture here, I mean this part right here in the root is under the ground. You might think that these are two separate plants if you were just looking at them, but genetically they're the same. This root has sort of extended on, and then a whole new plant has grown. But this daughter plant, if you will, or root sprout, is genetically the same as the original plant. And so that's what this conversation is all about. Here's a real picture of this, where you can see how the root is extending here. The stem is extending, I meant to say, and you can see little root systems coming off of it. And then these shoots that are coming up right up here with leaves on them, these vegetative branches, if you will, are all genetically the same. So this is an example of vegetative reproduction. One of the most successful trees that reproduce vegetatively is the California redwood tree. No surprise there. They have these big masses of tissue at the base of their trees called redwood burls. And these big buttresses that are basically clusters of meristematic tissue, which can become active, especially after some sort of stress like a fire that comes through the forest. And as a result, these redwood burrows start sprouting these new plants. But these new plants are genetically clones of the original parent plant. And as you're probably aware, in another class, we are studying that notion right there. We're looking at the DNA sequence of these sprouts and the parent tree. So it's kind of cool. Now, there's an advantage of that because you're able to grow very rapidly and be able to use the root system of the parent. Now, so this asexual reproduction is basically kind of an extension of the plant's indeterminate growth, if you will. If you go back here, one can say this redwood tree, it's tough to kill it, considering that it just continues to grow and grow, and then its offspring are growing. And fundamentally, this is the same tree as the parent, so it continues to grow. So it's kind of indeterminate. And you need this meristematic tissue, which are the cells that are actually undergoing mitosis. Once cells have specialized into different tissue types, then the cells are reluctant to divide. And so basically, it's kind of simple. You can just sort of cut portions off of plants. They're called cuttings, and you can just simply cut. And obviously, when you do that, it doesn't have a good root system if you were to cut the stem like that. And so what you would need to do prior to this picture is you take your cutting, maybe put it in a plastic bag, a Ziploc bag, maybe with a damp paper towel, and make sure that it's getting enough moisture. And then little tiny roots will begin to grow from the stem. And then you're able to transfer it to like a terracotta pot like this and get it to grow. So it's a good cheap way of making your own plants. How about that? And so take a look at this in nature. This is a picture of some deserts. This happens to be in California, the Mojave Desert. This is creosote bush. And look at this. You would think when you look at this is a cool example of uniform pattern of dispersion, but you might look at this from a distance or from your car and think that these are all separate. But if you went down there and took some tissue samples and you sequence some genes, you would be able to determine that this is all one plant. Yeah, and so under the ground, it's sort of using vegetative reproduction in order to extend itself out, and it's thought to be, when dated, 12,000 years old. Isn't that incredible? So this is an example of fragmentation, where the parent plant separates into parts like that, forming whole new plants. Another example of vegetative reproduction. I find this to be really interesting too, because in dandelions, I think most of us are familiar, like for example, if you wanted to make a wish, you'd grab this dandelion and blow on it, and then the seeds would blow away. What's interesting about the dandelion seed is that the seed is not the result of sexual reproduction, which it is usually. This is basically the diploid cells making diploid seeds. And so this is an example of asexual reproduction. It's called apomixis. And as a result of that, these seeds inside the ovule of the flower, the ovule gives rise to an embryo and then into a seed, and these seeds are genetically the same as the parent plant. And so, why would a dandelion do this? Well, look at this mechanism of dispersal. They have their own little parachute. It's kind of cool, right? So the seed helps them to disperse a little bit better than just normal vegetative reproduction, and it kind of combines the best of asexual with seed dispersal. Kind of neat. And so what I want to say is most plants sort of have complementary sexual and asexual in their life histories. They're capable of both. And so in a separate video, I'll talk a little bit more about the advantages of sexual reproduction, but just briefly, as you may already know, that sex generates variation, because when you're forming the gametophytes, in other words, the embryo sac and pollen, the male and female, what you're doing by doing that is creating variation through meiosis. And then through random fertilization, you create even greater diversity. And so why have diversity in your offspring? Why is that such an advantage? Well, it assists where environment is changing in the future, and also evolving pathogens are trying to attack you. Therefore, your whole population or gene pool won't be devastated. So sex is extremely important. But the seeds that are produced by sexual reproduction can also be dispersed. That's another advantage of sex. And the seed doesn't have to grow right away. And so how about that? The offspring can sort of just hang out on the ground and wait for favorable conditions. What an incredible advantage. So not only are most of the seeds enclosed in fruit, which are animals are helping to disperse, but so there's seed dispersal, there's genetic variability, so it's advantageous, but they can also be dormant and wait for environmental conditions to get better. So sexual reproduction, it's really successful. Although, we're talking about asexual at the moment, but let me sort of illustrate this. What we're talking about, this is the male cone of a gymnosperm. We often don't talk about gymnosperms. So this is the pollen, the male gametophyte, and it travels over usually by wind we're talking about a gymnosperm. It goes inside and fertilizes the egg, and then seeds are formed inside the cone. This is the female. And then the cone will either fall down or the seeds will fall down onto the soil, and they'll be able to grow into a new tree. And so this is genetically different. Even if the plant is self-pollinating, it's still genetically different, because the pollen may be different because of meiosis, or it could even be cross-pollination. So you get variation. So variation is really important. The thing is, asexual reproduction, though it doesn't get any variation, its advantage is that the clones can copy themselves very, very rapidly. And so you can sort of dominate an area very quickly. Seems very good. And then also, the plants, when they're growing, are not as fragile as the seedlings produced in sexual reproduction. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, if you had over here, like I was just talking about, if you had one of these seeds that resulted in sexual reproduction, Get a little tiny redwood tree growing like this with a little tiny root system. I mean, if it doesn't rain, it may not be able to get enough water and it'll simply die. Or if it's really dark in the forest, which it often is in a redwood forest, light is kind of limiting, it may not be able to grow. It's very hard for a seed to be able to germinate and grow like this. But check this out. Asexual, through vegetative reproduction, it's able to grow, and then look at this. It's using the whole root system of the parent plant. It's fabulous. It kind of reminds me of like a college student a little bit. When they're off in college, they're still using their parents' root system, metaphorically. So, the good thing, though, about the seed is that, it can actually be sitting here, and there's no need for, the seeds could fall, okay? So here's the seeds, and then you've got some redwoods growing here, and everything's fine. These are all clones, but then you have some redwood seeds over here just waiting and being dormant. And you're like, well, when are these seeds going to be able to reproduce? Well, maybe they're going to reproduce after a big fire comes along, or fire, and it burns off a little bit of the fallen leaf material or needles called duff, and therefore it increases the nutrient value, and it sort of wears away the seed coat a little bit, and then therefore under I wanted to show you this. This is what the seeds actually look like. They remind me of oatmeal. Isn't this incredible that this, the largest, most fabulous tree in the world, the coastal redwood tree, starts off so humbly as a little tiny seed like this. That's a great metaphor for life too. Such great things can come from such a small package. So maybe after a disturbance, see, this is an advantage of seeds. Like fire comes, or something kills off, or a drought in the area kills off some of those clones. And so these are those other trees that are in the neighborhood. And then the seeds in the soil, now it's their time to germinate when the conditions are sort of improved. And so what's fascinating is, here you go, like once a fire comes and gets rid of some of the clones, like this, you can see then maybe some of the seeds which are down below will start to grow, and maybe they're better off in the future now, given that the environmental conditions are a little bit different. And so this thing about vegetative reproduction or vegetative propagation, this is really critical, not only in the forest, but it's critical in agriculture. You'd be surprised how important this is to not only farmers, but those involved just in mass production of plants that we use in greenhouses that we sell just for sort of ornamental purposes. And so you can get rows and rows and rows of these petri dishes like this, and you can simply cut pieces of them. They're called cuttings. And these plant fragments, which are typically like little roots little shoots and stems of plants, and you could soak them in water, like I was saying. You don't want them to get too much water. And you could basically cut these up. So they're literally called cuttings. And then you can take this and you can plant it, and it'll grow as an independent plant. So it's a great way to mass produce plants. Like, for example, geranium. That's an important cash kind of a crop. People like geraniums. Or maybe you want to grow geranium. Grow these in your garden, and you don't want to, maybe you're being cheap about it, you don't want to go to Orchard or something and drop $100 on these geraniums. So you just want to buy a couple of them, let them grow a little bit, and then cut them up. And then you want to plant these cuttings. Now, they don't have a root system, and so they're likely to die. So you have to give them a little moisture medium, in other words, paper towel, Ziploc bag, or else they won't do very well. And then this is kind of interesting. This is what they look like. Once you put them in a Ziploc a little bit and you've been putting some water on it, look at this. They start growing independent little root system right here. And so I have a little video that I want to show you of this guy that I found on YouTube who's a gardening tips, and I think it's kind of funny.
Here's one we took a few weeks ago, and I'm praying and hoping that it's rooted to show you. So let's have a look in here. This is a fuchsia cutting, by the way.
It's a fuchsia.
And if we take it very gently out of here, I can see them. I can see the roots. I'm getting that thrill again.
Look at that.
Because there they are, look. So that didn't use any of the staging space. And now I'm going to pop that up as I would normally do, using a bit of this sandy compost. And I'm safe in the knowledge that that is a rooted cutting. It's going to forge ahead and become a beautiful plant later on.
Now, when you talked about cutting compost, like you could buy cutting compost. It's like special. Well, it's actually just regular compost, which is high in nutrient. And the reason it's called cutting compost is that there's a little bit more sand in there. If you remember from our soil video, that sand doesn't allow a lot of water to accumulate, so water percolates because you don't want to overwater your cuttings. That's kind of brutal. So you could do this cuttings. It's kind of useful. And so let's go back over here if we can. And whoops. And so here's our roots coming. So at the cut end, the cells will start to divide, and this area right here, this little mass of tissue is called a callus, and that forms roots develop from these plant calluses. And so this is a big deal. If you're working in the gardening store, you'll be very familiar with this someday. And likewise, I don't know if you're familiar with this too. It seems so practical, but a lot of us are from the city and we don't really get this kind of fundamental thing. But did you know this? Like the eyes of a potato, which is a tuber, modified underground stem, whole potato plants can grow from this. And so you could take a potato and literally like cut it up. As long as it has some of these eyes on it, each one of them will develop its own shoot system and its own root system. So you can make a bunch of potatoes from just one. You could just go out in your garden and start chopping up potatoes and start heaving that. Although, again, you'd want to make sure that they had plenty of water in the beginning and then not so much water. But you could regenerate like these African violets. These are kind of beautiful, and they can grow even from a simple leaf. That's kind of interesting. And then, more practically speaking, like to really show you the economic importance of these cuttings. Do you know that like one of the most important crops in California is grapes? It's very, very serious. And so people say when we're looking into wine and that sort of thing, they say, the grapes in France are just simply the best, and there's no comparison. And so, it's difficult to sort of just take a grape vine from France and put it in California and grow it in the Napa Valley. For example, the root system is maybe not adapted to the particular pathogens that are in the soil of California. And so one way to get around that is simply like cut the vines. You see this? You can cut off pieces of grapevine, and then you could literally like fracture the stem and root system of a California vine and like literally like stick these French grafts or cuttings into the California one. And so I know those are two different species, but it doesn't matter. They will start to grow, and so this is kind of interesting. Look at this. So you can stick portions of grapes into the stalk of, so for example, French wine is thought to have these superior grapes, and you can actually stick them into an American root system, and then they're able to grow. I find that kind of interesting. And then if you really wanted to step up your game like in the lab, you really don't even need soil. You can just grow plants vegetatively from cuttings, and the little calluses will grow right here. And you're like, well, is that agar? Yeah, you could use agar, and it's the same growth medium that you would use to grow bacteria. And you can put in all the nutrients inside your sugar gel, and they'll grow very nicely, provided they have lots of light. So you can grow lots of different cuttings this way. You can culture them in these test tubes. So plant culturing, it's very, very cool. And then you could even give them some hormones to make them grow even faster. How about that? And why would you want to do that? Well, you could study them. For example, we do that a lot with orchids because orchids are very desirable, and so we can clone them, mass produce them this way, and sell them. And also, we're trying to experiment with like different types of wood. We know that there's certain pine trees that will grow very rapidly, and maybe this is a good way to recolonize an area that has been lumbered. And so we might be able to reproduce those particular pine trees more efficiently in the lab and then put those out into the forest. And then likewise, things like sunflower seeds are really popular. And so here's a beautiful sunflower here, the seeds over here. Maybe what we want to do is genetically engineer some of these calyces to produce, maybe transfer some genes in there. Sorry about that. Let me come over here. Maybe transfer some genes into the sunflower seeds and make it transgenic or genetically modified in order to produce better protein, for example, to make it a more complete protein if people eat more sunflower seeds. And then, like, look at this scientist here. She's growing a plant cutting here in the plant callus. And so this thing's called a DNA gun or a gene gun, and you can simply place that right on top of your petri dish, and like a real gun, it shoots these pellets out, but these beads are coated and been dipped in DNA, and so when those bombard the plant tissue, the cell walls, they literally break through and deposit some of the genes that you're trying to transfer. So you can genetically engineer these cuttings as well and manipulate them in the lab. So I hope you enjoyed our conversation today about asexual reproduction in plants. Thanks for watching.